So last week, you know, the message was about seeking God's presence. And so we kind of came down to four prayers that we could pray when we are seeking God's presence. Today's message is about what happens when you are in God's presence. I'm sure there's a long list of things. Many things could happen when we are in God's presence. We experience a sense of rest, of comfort. There's restoration. Walls break down. We experience freedom. We feel convicted. There's a long list of things that could happen. But today I want to focus on just one area. It is about when we are in God's presence, our perspective changes. So the title of the message is Presence and Perspectives. So just going to start with praying. Holy Spirit, just come and just really use me in this time, Lord. Speak through me, every word that I say. I want it to be what's on your heart. Whatever preparation has happened, irrespective of that, Lord. I just really submit and surrender everything these next 10-15 minutes, Lord, into your care. In Jesus' name. Okay, so presence and perspectives. So just like last week when we were looking at the word presence, what does it mean? We learned that presence means face. It means about coming before the face of God. It's about coming up to the face of God. It's about being face to face with God. So that really intimate place to be in, where we're not just. When it's not just about us looking up close and personal with God, but God looking up close and personal at us and really deep within us. And at that point, there's pretty much nothing we can hide. You can't hide anything. It's like the difference between a WhatsApp video call and a WhatsApp audio call. Video call, or if you're at work, if you're dressed badly, or if you're distracted, or if you want to get up and pick up something to eat, you can't do any of that when you're on a video call. So it's really about just being completely tuned in and focused at that time. So that is what presence means. What does perspective mean? It means a way that we see things. So when we put presence and perspective together, what does it actually mean? It means that in God's presence, we find the right way to see things. In God's presence, we find the right perspective. So, just felt that this morning I would highlight 5 areas where that are in the Bible, in God's Word, where God's presence actually changed the perspective in 5 different areas. So we look at the first, which is in His presence, our perspective of God changes. That's the first thing. If you look at the book of Job, and I'm sure a lot of us know the story. All kinds of unjust and horrible things happen to Job. And Satan really goes all out. Except for taking his life, he does everything in his power. And he really makes his life miserable. And there are 30 chapters where Job and his friends are talking, and Job is trying to defend himself, he's trying to explain himself, he's trying to define his relationship with God, saying, I'm righteous, I have done nothing wrong. So all this happens for 30 chapters. And then what happens is that, because he thought he actually knew God, because he was God's favorite person actually at that time. God calls him, my faithful servant. He really says that out of all the people that he wanted Satan to do this test on, he chose Job, because he knew that Job was really, up to the mark in that sense. But then after those 30 chapters of talking, God speaks. And Job is silent. He has nothing to say. Because as I was seeing, Max Lucado actually says, that notice the change that happens when God speaks. Before he heard God, Job couldn't speak enough. After he heard God, he couldn't speak at all. And God doesn't explain why, what had happened, why, that the whole background about Satan and him and the test and da. He doesn't go into all of that. He just declares and tells Job about who he is. And after all that, Job says that my ears had heard you, but now my eyes have seen you. So even God's most favorite person didn't know God enough. Because even then he says, all this while I just had seen you, but now I really, now my eyes have seen you. I'm sorry, now my ears had heard you, but now my eyes have seen you. What a revelation that happened in Job 42 verse 5. So what happens actually, that in God's presence, what Job thought of God changes because God revealed himself. He realizes that even God's most favorite person, I did not know God, and this is who God is. So that's the first thing that happens in God's presence. Here, Job's perspective of God changed and shifted. So that's the first. The second area. In God's presence, our perspective of ourselves change. When Isaiah was in God's presence, he gets a revelation of the throne room of God. He sees him on this throne, the train of his robe fill the temple, angels are around, they're praising God, they're singing holy, holy. So he gets this revelation of who God is in his presence. And when he gets this revelation, what is his responses? He says, he recognizes that I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, in Isaiah 6:5. So when he was in God's presence, he got a revelation of who he was himself. And even then, when God is giving him the revelation, he's not revealing who Isaiah, he's not saying that you are a sinner, you are this. He just comes up in all that glory, and in that time, in that moment, he gets a revelation of who he himself is. So when God showed up, Isaiah saw something in himself that he himself didn't know about earlier. So just being in his presence changed his perspective of who he was himself. So in this example, it's about God's glory and Isaiah realizing what a unclean and sinful person he was. Maybe that was what God wanted Isaiah to know about himself in that moment. We've all had experiences where the reverse can happen, and I feel sometimes in today's context the reverse is more relevant, where we know that we are sinners and we need a revelation of being a child of God, the opposite. So that also happens because when we are bruised, when we are battered, we are abused, we are misused, all kinds of things are going wrong. When we are in God's presence, he lifts us up. And he changes our perspective of who we are by telling us that you're my child, you are loved, you're beautiful, you're cherished, you're blessed. Gideon calls himself, in Judges, he calls himself least in my family and his clan the weakest. And God says, you're a mighty warrior. So both happen. God can lift us and reveal who we are in as a child of God. And the opposite also happens, is maybe when we have pride or maybe when we have, God can also show us the other side. So it's not a very general picture. God reveals it in a very specific way, maybe what we need to hear at that point in time. And I know that's very relevant for me because I feel so much in so many moments in my life when I have felt not good enough, not enough in any way, when I feel that I'm not doing my best. And God has actually told me that in that moment about how precious I am. So therefore, in God's presence, the second area is that our perspective of ourselves change. And not in a general way, but in a specific way for what God wants us to know about ourselves in that season of our lives. The third area is that in his presence, our perspective of situations changes as well. You mentioned Elijah actually when you, and I was just saying that's one of the stories that we have here that I thought of actually, is that Elijah has had this awesome moment in the mountain, calls down fire, calls down rain, when there were 3 years of drought, and all that happens. And then soon after that, he actually becomes suicidal. Because he goes to the mountain and God says, go to the mountain and I'll meet you there. And his main complaint was what? That no one is left. There's nobody worshipping God. There's only me. I'm the only person. So just take my life. It's really not worth it. So that was the situation. That's what he thought was the reality of the situation he was in. But he was wrong. Because when God says, go to the mountain, he tells him that no, you have work to do. And by the way, there are 7,000 more people. It's not just you who have not bowed their knees to Baal. So, and he tells him that you have work to do. You have a prophet to mentor. You have 2 kings to anoint. You got a lot of stuff to do. So he changes his perspective about the situation that Elijah actually thought he was in. That he was the only one in that, and he really had no purpose. There was nothing for him to do. So Elijah leaves there and goes back to continue his ministry. So if we take our problems and any situation that we are in into God's presence, he changes our perspective of the situation. He doesn't let it go away, but he changes the way we look at it. He changes the way we think about it. So that's the third area. That in his presence, the perspective of the situation we are in changes. The fourth area is that in his presence, our perspective of the questions we have also changes. We have so many questions. I'm sure, we are all in the same boat. We have big questions, sometimes small questions. We have questions about life and what our purpose in life is, or the very important, very often said, why do good things happen to bad people, or the other way around. We have all these questions. In Psalm 73, the psalmist also has a similar predicament. He talks about how the wicked are carefree and they're increasing in wealth, they are becoming prosperous. And in verse 16, he says that when I try to understand this, is difficult. I don't understand why is all this happening around me. And he tells God, I don't understand it. And then there's a gem in the next verse, in verse 17. And the starting of that verse is, when I entered the sanctuary of God, I understood. So when he stepped into God's presence, when he entered, he understood. And what did he understand? God basically explains to him that this life is not all of it. There is eternity. And though things look really hunky-dory for all the evil ones around us, but in the context of eternity, they are destined for destruction. So what happened in this story? That in God's presence, the psalmist's perspective of that question changed. It changed, And he got an answer which maybe he was not seeking that kind of an answer, but he got the answer that he wanted. So God actually spoke to him in that. So that's the fourth area. That in his presence, our perspective of the questions we ask also change. The last one is, in his presence, our perspective of life in general also changes. Who am I? What is my purpose? What am I doing? What should I do next? Should I take this job? Should I not? We have a lot of, one is everyday questions, but we have very big life questions as well. Moses had given up on his dream at 80 years old. He'd given up on his dreams of delivering Israel. He was back to being a shepherd, a broken man, and he probably thought that that's the way his life was going to end. And then he experienced God's manifest presence through the burning bush. And his perspective of his own life completely changed. God tells him, go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people Israelites out of Egypt. His whole life changed in that moment. God's heart was revealed to him. and His purpose. So what happens? Again, that in God's presence, our perspective of our own life also changes. What our purpose is, what are the things that we need to do. So therefore, these are 5 areas where some examples, I'm sure there are many, many more examples, where our perspective changes when we step into God's presence. It's about who God is, about who we are, about what our situation is, the questions we have, our life in general, all of this. The other interesting thing in these stories actually is that, when we seek God first, when we step into His presence, it's not only about perspective in our mind changes, it actually leads to action. Like whether it was Elijah who then went ahead and did his ministry, whether it was Moses who went ahead and then did things. So it's not just about, okay, in my head there's a shift that happens. It leads to action. It leads to things actually happening around us. So, I just wanted to end this actually on a very personal note, and I hope I get through this without getting all. So the last 3 days actually have been extremely tough for me. There have been days of great joy, and deep sorrow. So my company Wherefore turned 1 4 days back. So it was a day that was very happy. We didn't expect so many good things to happen, and we were in such a great place. Me and my partners, we were really grateful, felt so blessed. Then there was a day after that there was something that happened work related, not between me and my partners. That was a very sad incident that happened. I'm not getting into the details, but it was about work, and it really made me feel broke my heart to some extent. But the next day my heart really did break, because I have just one first cousin. We're a very small family. So I just have one first cousin, and my first cousin is about exactly a year older than me. She would be 44 in the next 10 days. She passed away. She'd been ill for many, many years, but I don't think any of us really expected it to happen. And she's the one and only. I don't have any other cousins, so that's my only one. So I went through this time of extreme grief, and I was quite a mess. I was in Bombay at that time. Of course, I loved her deeply. And when I was thinking, I was preparing for this, and I realized that there were in just the span of 3 days, there were 2 small incidences that happened that actually brought these areas, made it more instead of just academic, made it much more real for me. So the first thing was, when I was preparing for this, I was very distracted. It wasn't even I was distracted by one thing, because all this was happening, and my mind was all over the place. And I remember just messaging Uday saying, I'm just not able to focus. First I said I'll do it on Thursday, then I'll do it on Friday, then I said no, I'll send it to you on Saturday. Ultimately I sent it only yesterday, because I was all over the place in my head. I couldn't think through. And but even in that place, I kept just saying, God, I just want you. I want to hear you. I want to be in your presence. Just tell me what to do. But I was going all over the place. And so it wasn't, you hear those stories of going into God's presence and being all relaxing and sitting back, and it wasn't that. I knew I was in God's presence, but I was all over the place at the same time. And I was typing, I think the second point, was it the first or whatever? I was typing the line, in God's presence we get a perspective of who we are and our identity. I was actually typing that line out, and a WhatsApp message popped up on the side. And Zoe was with Akshay at the Rao household in Bombay. So a video, and Akshay said, here's a video of Zoe. And I typed that line about wanting, and I opened that video, and Zoe was playing the keyboards. And she was singing, the line she was singing was, I'm no longer a slave to fear, I'm a child of God. And of course I broke down crying, because it's I didn't even know that I was in God's presence, but what I needed to hear at that time. And this video popped up, and that was the line. And with all that was happening in my life at that time, I didn't even know that that's exactly what I needed to hear, that God, that I was His child. So in His presence, God actually showed me specifically what I needed to know, and He reconfirmed my identity in Him. So yeah, so the second point of, I knew it, He changed the perspective, not changed, but reconfirmed who I was in His presence. The second thing that happened the same night was at night I was sitting at my uncle's house, and of course I was very upset, I was crying. And I was just wondering, I was thinking about my cousin Mihika, and I was thinking, because she had a degenerative disease, there was no communication and all for quite a few years. So I kept thinking, I kept saying, God, did she know she was loved? Did she feel alone? Because she couldn't speak, so I really don't know. And I was, I kept saying that, I hope she knew how loved she was. I hope she knew how that we were all there for her, though, she didn't know what was happening around her. And I kept saying that, and I kept thinking, that did she know? And then God reminded me of actually Mum. I didn't tell you this. Mum has been praying for Mihika every day for, I don't know how long. Every day, every night she prays. And in that moment, this is the line that came to my mind. God kind of put that in my mind, saying, you have been praying for her, Mom has been praying for her, you have brought her into the picture. She didn't know Jesus. You have brought her into the picture, and so I never left her. I was with her right through the entire time. So I'm just thinking that even then when I was talking to God, and I was, I was in His presence, but I was just at so many of these things, God revealed who He was, that He was Mihika's father, and He was not going to let go of her, and He didn't let go of her till the end. And He reminded me of that at that time. Yeah, so in conclusion, just thinking that, let's all just make Psalm 27 our prayer, which is, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on His beauty and to seek Him in the temple. And it goes on in verse 8, my heart says to you, seek His face, your face, Lord, I will seek. So just end with a small song, but just as we just sing this, just to ask God, just to seek His presence out every moment of our lives, and to know that in that moment things happen. He changes perspectives, and He does much more, but that is one of the things that He does.